I wanted to talk about what Ukrainians are currently facing in occupied territory. So in the discussion about the war in Ukraine, specifically abroad, there's a lot of pontification about peace deals and a lot of pontification about how we can end the war as quickly as possible. And that's something that I know the Trump campaign has pushed very hard. Big Drone, thank you so much for the tier 1. For example, Donald Trump has said on the campaign trail that if he was elected president, he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. Now, I don't like this type of commentary, and it's not because they're trying to pursue peace. If somebody genuinely wants to negotiate just for peace, but also understands that in pursuance of peace, signing away a people's liberation, or people's freedom away, should not be something you're willing to do, unless the people whose liberation you're signing away or freedom you're signing away is up to do that. Definitely if they're the people suffering and dying, right? We need to know the true stakes of what's going on. And it feels like time and time again, when I listen to Donald Trump's commentary, when I listen to commentary of Vivek Ramaswamy, another Republican on the campaign trail, when I listen to the commentary of so many people, when they talk about peace deals, when they talk about settlements, when they talk about freezing the contact line, sometimes even permanently, that means the front line as it is right now. A lot of people don't know about the consequences, the permanent consequences this is going to have for the people in occupied territory. And the Kiev Independent wrote a fantastic piece breaking down the problems that people in occupied territory are facing right now, and how those in occupied territory who do not accept Russian passports, who don't work with the government, who don't accept Russian passports, and are just sitting out and not even like agitating the government, but are just letting the occupation do their thing, and they're doing their own thing, they could face imprisonment, jail time, and even deportation and the loss of their homes and property due to not signing with the government to get a passport, giving them fingerprints, and giving them passport photos of themselves, and a lot of private information that a government would usually require of its citizens, because the Russians are trying to make their occupation permanent and either scare those who oppose it into submission, or straight up just take away their property and kick them out of the country and give it to a Russian settler. Anyway, let's read this article by the Kiev Independent. As Russia's largely exhausted its military personnel on the battlefield, the Kremlin continued its silent... One second, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more here. Yeah, one second, let me see if I can... Yeah, that's better. As Russia largely exhausted its military potential on the battlefield, the Kremlin continued its silent warfare in occupied territories to convert millions of Ukrainians into Russian citizens. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an executive order in late April that set a deadline for applying for Russian citizenship in occupied areas of Ukraine. Those who refuse and elect to hold on to their Ukrainian passports face losing their property rights, prison sentences, and deportation from their homes. Experts say that with this executive order, Putin is looking to expel those unsympathetic to his regime from the occupied territories, while potentially setting the stage for further invasions under the pretext of protecting Russian citizens. They also warn that it paves the way for the mass surveillance of Ukrainians. Holding Russian citizenship in occupied territories also means that Moscow could conscript locals and force them to fight against their own country. Now, I am going to continue, but I just want to note, this is something that they've done before, and this is something that they're trying to expand right now. The Russians have forcefully conscripted people in occupied territory, put them in the DNR or LNR units, the Donetsk People's Republic or Luhansk People's Republic units, then sent them to the front line to die. This is a war crime and banned under the Geneva Convention. You cannot force people in occupied territories through conscription to pick up arms and fight against their fellow countrymen, and to fight against the government that, you know, internationally, legally controls that territory. Holding Russian citizenship in the occupied territory... Oh, already read that. Passportization, or issuing passports in a foreign territory, is not a new move by the Kremlin. After annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia forced citizenship on over 2 million people on the peninsula through automatic passportization, a practice that grants citizenship en masse to residents of occupied territories without their consent or input, and in some cases, even in their absence. 3 years later, the Kremlin expanded its passportization to include parts of Ukraine's eastern Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, occupied by Russia in 2014. Instead of automatic passportization, a blatant violation of international law, the Kremlin shifted tactics in an attempt to coerce Ukrainians to take on Russian citizenship themselves. Russia has extended its passportization even further into Ukrainian territories Russia claims to have annexed since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The executive order is like a vacuum cleaner. It is now picking up all the loopholes that have allowed people under occupation to live without needing a Russian passport. Okay, this goes further into it, and I do want to skip a little bit down into here to read like personal testimony from those in occupied territories. Okay, so we're gonna read that in a second, but before we read that, I want to just say a few things. First things first, when people talk about negotiating territory in Ukraine, especially I hear this from people who have not been to Ukraine or foreign commentators who are just pontificating about an issue that they don't really know that much about. It's that, it's just land. It's just lines on a map. At the end of the day, it is what it is. What the Ukrainian people want more than anything, and what the Ukrainian people need more than anything, is an immediate peace deal, no matter the cost, because the death toll is just so gigantic. Now, this assumes a few things. Number one, this assumes that this is what the Ukrainians want, is that they want to freeze the contact line and sign away Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. I mean, that's a lot of territory. I think there's about 13 million people in the territory, the occupied territory, or near the front line, near occupied territory, at risk of being under occupied territory. Now, all those people are not really taken into consideration in that in this worldview, right? What they want, what polling data we do have from Ukraine when it comes to what they believe and what the majority of Ukrainians want, which is the return of all of their territory. All the polling data I've seen shows that the vast majority of Ukrainians, well over 80% from every poll that I've seen no poll stating under 70%, or I mean under 80%. All polls are over 80% saying that they don't want to give up any territory, and that includes Crimea. That includes Crimea. And it's not surprising that they don't want to sign away millions upon millions upon millions of people to live permanently under occupation, or many of them being displaced, sign away their own homes, which they had to give up 5, 6, 7 years ago from Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, when they had to flee the Russian occupation and the thugs and militias that they armed in eastern Ukraine. They don't want to sign that stuff away. So the first part of that premise, which is wrong, is this is what the majority of Ukrainians want. The second thing is that's what the majority of Ukrainians need. Now, ultimately, that's an opinion, right? What, this country or that country or this people need to do to improve or, succeed as a society, that's an opinion. But many Ukrainians have made the point to me that until they have regained this territory and they've liberated their people, that this struggle against the Russians are just going to continue. That until they get their territory back and until they get their people liberated and a permanent security arrangement that would guarantee the Russians don't invade again, which the Budapest Memorandum was supposed to be originally. For those of you who don't know, the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement we signed both with the Russian Federation, the United States, and Ukraine, which made Ukraine agree to sign away its nuclear arsenals in return for territorial integrity being respected, their territory being respected. Crimea is Ukraine, Donetsk is Ukraine, Luhansk is Ukraine, everything is Ukraine. And up until 2008, Vladimir Putin was saying that there's no ethnic issue in Ukraine, there's no problem in Ukraine, all of this territory is Ukrainian, and there is no ethnic issue. That was until, of course, the geopolitics kicked in, the strategic thinking kicked in, and maybe he became a little bit more honest about his Russian nationalism. Maybe he felt pressured by the international backlash to his 2008 invasion of Georgia, and he's trying to brush off further concerns. In fact, that's what I think it was. Either way, the international community signed that agreement, I say the international community, but it was the United States, Ukraine and Russia in order to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity, to try to guarantee peace and stability in the region, and it failed. And so what most Ukrainians want is something like the Budapest Memorandum, except it actually works this time. And most Ukrainians seem to believe that NATO membership would be the path. The polling data seems to suggest that the majority of Ukrainians want to join NATO because they look at other NATO countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries that Russia also disputes the sovereignty of to some degree. Because if you look at, Vladimir Putin's opening speech about the war, he seemed to put every post-Soviet state's sovereignty up into question, saying that the Ukrainian state was created artificially by Lenin, and that all these states owe themselves to the Soviet Union, they owe themselves to the Russians, and that if these states exist in an anti-Russian way, that they can take away their sovereignty at any time. And that also applies to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Russian foreign policy, the domination of the post-Soviet space, that's been, for a very long time, that has been the public position, basically, of the Russian government. They want to dominate the post-Soviet space. Really ever since Putin has taken power, at least since the early 2000s. And Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are most certainly within that preview. And their strategic planning, their military moves, their rhetoric, and the speech opening this war would show that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are also countries that are in Russia's target zone. They are within Russia's sights. But the difference between Ukraine and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even though altogether, those countries would probably have a smaller military force than what Ukraine can muster, they haven't invaded them because of Article 5 of NATO. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of the Baltic countries are NATO states. They're part of NATO. And Article 5 clearly states that if one nation was attacked, then it's an attack on all. So an invasion of Estonia or any of these other nations would mean the full force of NATO's armies, including the United States, Germany, France, would come to their defense. And so most Ukrainians see that as the most stable long-term protection because it's worked for Poland, it's worked for them, and it's now working for Finland. Soon it'll work for Sweden. Why can't it work for Ukraine as well? It doesn't have to be that. It could maybe be some individual arrangements. For example, okay, you won't join NATO, but maybe you can have a defensive pact with America or the UK or both or a few other countries to make up for a lack of NATO membership and some compromise. But either way, they need long-term security alliances. They need long-term security agreements. And so these are already big issues. But a big issue that, and I'm sorry I'm rambling talking about this at length, but that's just how I go. But the big thing that has always angered me the most is that this thinking that the best path towards peace is to accept whatever the arrangement on the floor is on the ground right now, even if it greatly benefits the Russian occupiers. It's not only does that remove the sovereignty of the people living locally who have been forced off their land, or the people over the last 8-9 years who have been forced off their land, which counts in the millions, by the way. But it's also going to not really legalize in the international sense, but it's going to permanently institutionalize the Russian occupation, which means that all the extrajudicial killings, all the mass graves, all the crimes, all of the horrendous actions of the Russian state, the torture, the political control over daily life, everything. All of that is going to be institutionalized in the occupation zone and most likely turned up to 11 because they're in an occupation zone and they're not in Moscow. So all of the stuff that you see in Moscow that's already authoritarian, people protesting in any way, getting arrested immediately, the slightest amount of critique of the Russian government getting you arrested, that type of authoritarian control is going to be turned up to 11 in Ukraine because they're in an area where they're probably going to get retaliatory violence. They're going to have car bombings. They're going to have assassinations. They're going to have shootings. They're going to have all sorts of stuff from locals who are being forced to take a Russian passport, who have seen these atrocities, who have seen these crimes, who have seen torture, who have seen their rights taken away and their nation taken away and their identity denied. There's going to be a backlash and any fallout where the front line is institutionalized as it is right now, and the occupation is institutionalized. And so they're going to crack down even harder than what we're seeing domestically in Russia, as they have so far in the war. And do we really think that that's a peace in the way that me and you think of peace? Is it peaceful to find out that your neighbor just disappeared and got shot in the back of the head and dumped in the local river? Is it peaceful to walk down the street and actually sometimes in some neighborhoods, this was the case. It was the case in Izium. You could hear the screams from the torture chamber that was set up by the Russian government. That doesn't sound very peaceful. That doesn't sound very peaceful at all.
Burns is an
You just traded shelling and firefights on, in cities for torture chambers and targeted extrajudicial killings on the streets of occupied territory. Not to mention the fact that this peace could fall apart at a moment's notice. It could be passed down to another generation of Ukrainians, the struggle for independence, the struggle for freedom. That's another consideration that's never taken to effect, which means that these terrible, terrible practices could be institutionalized across the occupied territory for 5 years, meaning 5 years of suffering, 5 years of deportation, 5 years of torture, 5 years on top of the already 8 years of occupation in Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. And then you have another war, meaning that you've taken that on the chin for nothing, possibly with the Russians in a better position because they could have more time to organize themselves. Maybe when they don't think the war is going to last 3 days, they can prepare better and have a better, beat at the starting line. These are all things that are not taken into consideration. But I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling and talking about a lot of things here. But my main point I want to take away from this is that when we talk about the peace deals and the arrangements and how this is all going to be organized once the war is said and done, very little thought is put into how those in occupied territory are going to be treated if that territory is signed over permanently to the Russians. And the way this article talks about it and the way many other Ukrainian activists talk about it is going to be what is institutionalized in occupied territory. It is going to be how things are run moving forward. And we need to realize that reality.
Has donated $10. Dylan, I've been meaning to ask you this. Who is the DOOD? Who says, Burns is an immoral, morally bankrupt man?
Thank you. That's oh God, I can't believe I forgot his name. God, what I completely forgot. Andrew Wilson. It's Andrew Wilson from the Crucible podcast. He was criticizing me while talking to Critically Thinking Veteran, an old friend of mine that I used to work with a lot more during the hippy dippy debate days. Old meme. It's not really that old of a meme. It's only a year old, but it feels like an old meme considering how much has happened since then. But yeah, that's from that time. Thank you for the $10. I appreciate it. Anyway, this type of atrocities will be institutionalized, and I think that is something that is not talked about enough in the media. They just kind of look at a big map and say, oh, all this will be signed away, but they don't understand what that will mean for the people on the ground or those displaced by the war, those displaced by the occupation. So let's read a few of the testimonies of those in occupied territory who have to deal with the Russian administration there. Olena from the Luhansk Oblast, occupied by Russia since 2014, is an example of quiet resistance to becoming a Russian citizen. Over the course of 6 years since Russia began its forced passportization campaign in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, Olena managed to keep her Ukrainian passport. That changed in late May when the local administration signaled that any social welfare would be unavailable for those who don't hold Russian citizenship. Olena was told it is impossible to have a Russian bank account without a passport, and that any payments would be made through Russian banks. They threatened to withhold payments. They do everything so that we apply for the passport ourselves, Olena told the Kiev Independent. Olena said she delayed having Russian citizenship as long as she could, but we don't have any choice now. If you live with wolves, you howl like a wolf, she said, referring to the Russian proverb. Not only have they occupied us, but they have also oppressed us, Olena said, adding that she wished she had left in 2014 when Russia occupied the town. With our pennies now, it's very difficult to leave. Even if you have enough money, it is still hard to leave the Russian-occupied territories with Ukrainian documents only. Roman, a native of Donetsk, also occupied by Russia since 2014, avoided becoming a Russian citizen as he didn't want to have any documents. Moscow or its proxies are issuing in the occupied parts of Donetsk Oblast. He appeared apprehensive regarding Putin's recent legislation, concerned that this development may prompt suspicion of him from Russian authorities, as he holds neither a proxy nor a Russian passport. They don't know I'm in Donetsk because I've never contacted the local authorities. I don't even have a local phone number. Roman was able to flee to Lithuania shortly after talking to the Kiev Independent. He was interrogated by the Russian FSB twice, with his lack of Russian citizenship raising suspicion. The FSB will interrogate, but not having Russian documents is not an offense so far. However, Luvina warned that the Russian security services would closely watch those who stayed without obtaining a passport, which could be seen as a sign of disloyalty. This keeps going. One thing I want to talk about, and it talks about at the end of this piece, is that different Ukrainian politicians are sending different messages. While so far the Ukrainian government has said on multiple occasions, the official Ukrainian government's position is that if you are forced to take a Russian passport in occupied territory, the Russian government will not penalize you. Now, there is a little bit of blurriness when around coercion, for example, because let's say they don't force you to take a Russian passport, but they're like, hey, do you want this bonus of money that can help you during this war zone? Just take this document, give us your fingerprints, and you can have this food, you can have this money, you can have this social support. That type of stuff is a little bit more blurry. That's compounded by the fact that some Ukrainian politicians and people in the government are saying, look, don't worry about it. If you take a Russian passport, you'll be fine. Just wait for the army or get out of there as soon as you can. But others are saying, don't take the passport. Just leave or wait for the army, but don't participate with the authorities. Don't cooperate with the authorities. Don't do anything with the authorities. There needs to be a clear, unified message from the Ukrainian government saying that anybody who takes a Russian passport, as long as they don't collaborate with the Russian occupation authority to commit war crimes and atrocities and, hurt people, then they should not come with any legal repercussions. I think that should be the clear message that they send as people are trying to survive in such dark and trying times in Ukrainian history. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this.